First, organizational announcement. Maybe please move a little bit more into the middle, so when more people are coming, they can find some space at the side. That would be very good. Just move a little bit more in the middle. Take the seats in the middle. That works. Okay. So actually, I have a lot of slides, so I need to start on time so that we can put everything good. My name is Wolfgang Ziegler, a father on DDTO, and I'm the real father on Twitter. Unfortunately, Pablo has been already taken, so only the real father there. I'm the maintainer of the Entity API module, Drupal 7 module, for all we know, and I'm also co-maintainer of the core Entity API and form components. And I've authored various concept modules like rules, field collection, or Drupal 2. And I'm also the CEO head of development of economics. So I'm going to talk about the Drupal 8 Entity API, and I will start a little bit of history on how did the Entity API evolve, and how did it happen that we even have an Entity API, and then I will cover how you can work with entities and how you can provide a new entity type. Or Drupal 8, of course, and then have some things on like how you can validate entities in Drupal 8 and how you can fill it out. And then we'll shortly have a look at more advanced stuff like configuration entities and type data stuff, and do a short comparison on the Drupal 7 entity module and how that compares to Drupal 8. And there are also two related talks to the Drupal 8 entity system. First off, there's a Drupal 8 fields recon talk by Weiche. So the Drupal 8 field stuff really ties a lot into the new entity API stuff. Actually, those two systems really work very close together now in Drupal 8. So you really should miss that session on Weiche. It's really interesting stuff and ties a lot into the Drupal 8 entity API, so you should catch that as well. In this talk, I'll only cover the fields at the really minimum level, so it's really just the basic things, and there are a lot of more details and configurable field stuff in this session, so that there's not a lot of overlap. It's really just the foundation stuff. And then next, we have a session about multilingual content in Drupal 8. So about using the Drupal 8 entity APIs in multilingual scenario. So if you're going to build multilingual sites with Drupal 8, that talk is going to be interesting to you as well. It's, I think, pretty detailed, and we'll give you a good introduction to that. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of history and entities in Drupal 8. So really, the entities in Drupal 8, they were nothing that we planned for in Drupal 7. So that they are more like a side effect that happened of the field API improvements in Drupal 7. And in Drupal 7, field API got improved to work with multiple objects. We were able to attach them to different kinds of objects, not only nodes. And in the end, it turned out, we'll make those objects entities, and that was pretty late in the Drupal 7 cycle. So it's really an unfinished API in Drupal 7 core. And this is also where the Drupal 7 entity module comes in. It just completes and tries to complement a lot of stuff in content, just to have a working solution somehow in content. That's of course not the same as having it at the core, but still it tries to complement things and makes it easy to work with Drupal 7, and I think it works quite well for that what it is. Yeah, but in Drupal 8, really now the idea is that it's completed in Drupal core, because the Drupal 7 entity API module, as it is, it cannot really fix the things natively, so we can't just move the Drupal 7 entity API module and take it to core, because it's really more an abstraction of the different things in Drupal 7 that didn't get solved yet. It's like when you save entities in Drupal 7, there are various different mechanisms. There's not one single mechanism to do that. So the entity API module in Drupal 7 basically can do an entity save. And in Drupal 8, the idea is that we don't want to have that abstractions, we just want to have the unique interface built in and the same API that I played for. So what we really need in Drupal 8 is class objects, so we can seamlessly work with the entity objects in Drupal 8 core. It should be based on a common interface, the entity interface, so you know how to deal with them, how to work with them. We really need to have full class support for them. That was really the missing part was in Drupal 7, we only had nodes there. In Drupal 8, we already have full class support. So that really was the beginning of improving entity API in Drupal 8. But it turned out that's not enough. We want to do way more. And we figured we also want to do a unification of fields and properties. When you think of Drupal 7, you have node titles and stuff like that, and a node that's not a field. That's completely different on an API level, and it also has a lot of consequences on how modules see the properties and how you can work with that in the end. So we really have been working hard on unifying that in Drupal 8 in a unified entity field API. And along with that, we also have added metadata about all the fields and properties on an entity, so you can leverage the metadata in the modules, build some UI to do something with that. Then we figured we'll need a validation API, because we need to be able to validate entities independently of form submissions, when you think of a REST server, for example, but more on that later. And then on top of that, we wanted to have some reusable components, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time when you want to render or edit an entity, for example. So we really want to have reusable components for that. So what's going to be an entity in Drupal 8? So initially the idea was more like, everything that's content, like comments, terms, nodes, users on our sites, that will be the traditional entities. But then we figured we need all the things. So there have been quite discussions about that, and in the end it turned out it's a good idea that we also implement configurations, some configuration objects, as configuration entities in Drupal core. So if you think of a node type or a view, it's also an object that you can load and save. So it's really the basic card mechanism is in place, and that's really what the entity API provides you with a unique interface for that. So we are implementing that in Drupal 8 also for the configuration entities, and you can use the same APIs to deal with that. So even a configured field, a field is an entity. It's just the configuration piece, it's a config entity that you just store to have the configuration of the field stored. The actual field value, that isn't, of course, an entity. So in practice, this looks like that. I'm not sure you can read that. So we have an entity interface, and we have two extended, more special interfaces, one for content entities and one for config entities. The entity interface really holds the generic stuff, and then there are, the more special stuff is done in the config and in the content entity, depending on where it fits. Okay, so now when you work with entities, I am mostly talking about the content entities here, because that's the most interesting part for the presentation, I think. So you mostly deal with the entity manager, which is the central point of managing your entities. That's a service that you create the balance injection container, so you can get it from the container, should be injected in your object then. But once you have the manager, you basically can get all the various helper, controllers and everything via the manager. So when you want to load an entity in Drupal 8, you don't call entity load. You actually get the storage controller of the entity type from the manager, and you call the load method on it. And then the load method is exactly the same as entity load, but just single. There's also load multiple Drupal 8. And what it gives you is an entity object, an instantiated and loaded entity object. As I said, it's a class object, so it has convenient methods on it, like getting the ID, entity type, label, and stuff like that. Then we also have an API to access all the field values, which works based on objects and some magic as well. Basically, it looks like you're accessing raw values, but in the back, some magic gets invoked and it deals with field objects. So when you do entity arrow subject arrow value, it basically gets you the value of a subject field. And that API also supports chaining. So like when you have an entity reference, you can just chain down. So the next example gets you just the name of the first tag of a field text field. So entity arrow field text, then the second gives you the first tag, then arrow entity actually is the full loaded entity object, so it will be the full term object, and from there you can of course make use of the entity API as well and continue to drill down just in one single line. Then we have some convenient methods on the object like has field to check whether an entity has a certain field. And then when you actually have field items, the field items are the object, and you also have context. When you have a field item, you can call the method get entity on it, and you will get back the entity object of the fields. When you have a node title, you have the item of the node title, it sits in a node, you'll get back the node object, like we're calling get entity on it. And to update, of course, you can just assign the value, and for saving, you're saving. It's straightforward. But we have more methods than that. In Drupal 8, we've really started to do also entity type specific methods. Like on a node, when you look on the node object, it actually also implements the node interface. It has domain specific methods like you can ask the node whether it's promoted to front page, whether it's published, everything. And there are methods for that, and we really should make use of that because it makes a better maintainable code. Then we have translation built in. The entity API in Drupal 8 has full multilingual support. And when you have an entity, there's the method get translation, which you can use to get the translation object from this new entity. So when you call entity gets translation, you pass the length. In that example, it's a German length. You'll get back a translated entity, which is also an instance of the same entity class. So you can work with the same APIs of the translation object. So to get the German title of the node, you can just do entity gets translation, pass the German length code, then access the title values as usual, and it will be the German title. And as such, the entity translation object is just another instance of the entity object, but it knows its language. So when you ask it the language, it will give you, okay, I'm the German version or I'm the English version, so you can call the language method on it to check that. And when you want to output something on a site, we usually should also apply language fallbacks on a multilingual site. For that, we have the help function entity manager. It's called gets translation from context. You just pass the entity, and you get back a translation object, which is just the right translation object in your context. Then you have a regular entity object, and you can continue to work with that, and you don't necessarily have to take care of the translation here. And when you have translation or an entity object in general, and you want to make sure that you're working with the original entity language, you can get that by calling the method get untranslated, which always gives you the original entity language object. Iterating. So if your entity field API and all being object oriented, you can just iterate over an entity object, and it will iterate over all the fields that are on the entity. So it will give you the field items. So it's basically a representation of all the field items that a field have. Like you're iterating on a node, it will give you the title, the tags, the body, everything. Like when you have tags, there are multiple field items, and you iterate over that, then you get the single item that holds the values of a single tag field. So it will contain the tag ID, and in the case of the text, it also contains the magic property to access the entity. Maybe a better example here is also an image field, because There we have multiple field item properties. So when you look at the field item of the lineage field, that's not only the value in there. We have the title that you can assign when you upload an image field, or the arts text in there, as well as the reference in the image file. So the field item, we have multiple field item properties which you can access just by the arrow, value, arrow, entity, or whatever is in there. And as you notice here, you look over it, and I mentioned multiple times, it's all fields. Also there's the stuff like the node title, the node status, everything that has been properties previously on our fields. But they're not exactly the same as the fields that you know it from Drupal 7, which are what we call now configurable fields, which are managed by the field API basically. So in Drupal 8 we have the general concept of entity fields, which is the general API and it's all the interfaces and everything. But then we have configurable fields, that's basically field API, which implements its interfaces and puts its fields on the entity objects. But then we also have base fields, which are the new version of the node title and that stuff, the entity properties. And they implement the same API, they implement the same interfaces, but they are not managed by the field API configurations. And then lastly, we also have a third category, some custom fields, which you can add via the hook to do some on the back calculations or add your own storage fields, but that's more something we still need to figure out yet in core itself, and we don't have good examples of it yet. Yeah, then you have config entities, and config entities don't have fields. So that's one major difference right now between content entities and config entities, and that content entities have fields and config entities don't. When you access a config entity, you actually will get a plain PHP value. Like when you access a view, the view is a config entity, and you access config name, it will be the view name, and it will be just a string. And when you do that with the node, which is a content entity, and you access node arrow title, it will actually give you the field objects. It's a field item list object, so it's a list of field items. Or in the case of node title, it will always contain only one field item. But still, we have put the same structure in place everywhere. We have for every field a list of field items, then you have the field item, and then we have the individual field item properties. That structure is in place for all of the fields. Okay, so let's have a look at how you can provide a new entity type. So as in today, it's mostly everything class-based, and that's the case for the entity API as well. So you're going to define a class, and you're going to put annotations on it for defining it. So that's really looking very much the same as a regular plugin that you would implement it with the plugin system, but it's not exactly a regular plugin. It's more a special case. And what you put on the class as annotation is basically what previously in Drupal 7 is what you would put in hook entity info. It's exactly the same information, but just at the Drupal 8 variant of it. So you basically define the entity type name, some label, and then you define your storage controller class, which is the controller class of Drupal 7, and then we have a bunch of other additional controllers which control certain aspects of the entity type. And we'll have a closer look at those later on. And then we have some more keys which you partly already know from Drupal 7, like entity keys and configuring whether your entity type is feedable and stuff like that. Then you have, of course, the class for your entity type. You can extend just on the base class, so you inherit all the basic methods. And you always should define a new interface for every entity type you're defining, so you can put entity type specific methods into that interface. So that's the basic definition. With that class and putting it into the right folder, the entity folder of your module will be discovered and it will be registered in the system. But for it to actually work, you of course have to define and you added definitions about those fields. That's pretty much the equivalent of the configurable field, which you would like right now in Drupal 7 configure via field API and export features and everything. But just that in that case, it's not configuration, you just set it up manually in code. And right now in Drupal 7, those definitions are actually array-based, but there's a patch we're working on which will make it like that, so it will be class object, and you will be able to use methods and everything on it, which makes it also very easy to have it working based on the same API as configurable fields, because configurable fields and those field definition objects implementing the same interface. Okay, then of course every entity type needs some storage, so you will have to take care of the storage. You implement your own storage controller for that. Again, you can just extend the base class that's provided with Drupal, and you can customize that if you want. And what's also new in Drupal 8 is that we have started to bring everything that talks to the database level into the storage controllers. Like when you have some queries that query your database, which actually queries the tables from your entity type, you just put a method on your storage controller where you put the query in and add it there. And then you just always call the method, and you do not directly query the database in your module. That really helps to collect all that access to the internal storage in the storage controller. So there's an easy way to see where all the storage code is, and you can easily plug that out. So when you would like to implement a different storage mechanism, you really have everything that accesses that internal storage in the storage controller by plugging it out, it will work. And those additional methods, of course, need to go into the interface as well. And so if you have that, you will need to define an extended interface for the storage controller also. Yeah, and then at the bottom line, you'll see how you could actually use and work with the storage controller. Again, as I've shown previously, you use the storage controller and you use the manager to get the storage controller, and you put the methods on it. You can load, you can save, and everything. There are shortcuts for example, save and delete on the entity object as well, but the primary API is the storage controller, as it's already the case in Drupal counter. And you always have some storage independent logic also, like when you think of comments, there's always logic taking care of threading, of assigning default values for UIDs, language codes, and everything. So there's always a bunch of storage independent logic that comes with the entity type. And in Drupal 7, we've mostly just baked everything into the controller class. But in Drupal 8, we figured out that the storage independent logic should be somewhere else, so that the storage class really is only about storage and not about something else. So in Drupal 8, we have some methods on the entity class which get automatically invoked, like post save, pre-save, post load, and so on, which allow you to very easily implement the storage independent logic on the entity class. So in this example, post save for comments, it takes care about some threading things and invoking comment specific hooks and stuff like that, because that's not storage specific. So that's really clearly separated in Drupal 8. Then another thing that we have been refactored using in Drupal 8 is the storage mechanism. So in Drupal 7, entity storage and feed storage are actually two separate things. In Drupal 8, we moved the storage also into the entity storage controller. So it's a single point that's responsible for the storage of your entity type. So it takes care also of creating all the field API-based tables and everything. There's a new interface with that, and it's just pluggable, so you can plug it out and implement your own logic as per user. Okay, some other controllers that are very useful. I would say is the next controller that's probably mostly used is the view builder. It's optional, so it's basically every controller as part of storage is optional. So we really just need to have the storage controller. Of course, your entity type needs storage, but everything more than that is optional. So if you don't assign that class in your entity definition, it won't be there, so you won't be able to use it. But if you want to use it, you just basically define the class, and you can always override, of course, the methods in your own variant. And so does the comment view builder. It just extends from the default entity view builder and just adds some custom stuff in build content. So you basically can override build content, add your custom content that you want to render with the entity there, call the parent so that it will add all the fields and everything for you, and work as usual on your side. And then when you want to invoke that API for another entity, you can, as usual, get the view builder object from the entity manager for a comment, call view on it, and it will render another entity for you. And it works the same way for forms. There are form controllers, we have base classes which you can extend, and we have the form method on it where we can integrate our own form elements, and there are also some other methods for like when you submit and validate the forms which you can override and customize. And again, for making use of the forms, you go to the manager and you have a method to get form which then gets you the entity form. It's actually the fully built and renderable form. But then for forms, we have multiple forms. In Core we right now have mostly the edit form and delete forms, but you could do multiple operations of forms. And there are also base classes that you can use for entity forms that make use of confirmations like deletion. And you can just use the base class, override the question, stuff like that, and it will work. It's really easy. And then to access it, you again can use the manager, will get form, and you just pass the operation key, which then will make use of the class that is defined in the entity definition. So the entity definition, you specify which class is going to be used for which operation, and that's it basically. You are free to add as many operations as you want. And then we have entity access support in Drupal 8. That's actually part that wasn't there at all in Drupal 7 in that form. So in Drupal 8 we have access controllers which are just written as all the other entity controllers. We have a base class, you can override methods as you want. You have check access, which you are usually overriding to implement custom access checks. And then we have a unified API based on the interface which you can use to actually check access of other entities. You get the access controller from the entity manager, and you can just call the access method on it to check view, edit access, or whatever on the entity. And then there's also a translation controller in Drupal 8. It allows you basically to customize how your entity type is integrating with the entity translation module of Drupal 8, which is called content translation. And yeah, it's nothing special here, and it actually doesn't really expose an API that you want to use from the outside. It's all taken care of by the entity translation module for you. So, then we have a list controller in Drupal 8, which is right now actually only used for config entities, but you could use, of course, use them for content entities as well. But usually people just use views there, so you don't need it. But of course, you could write a list controller that makes use of a view if you want. But the list controller that's provided with Drupal 8 Core, it's mostly targeted for admin screens, like when you have screens for managed node types and stuff like that. It's implemented in a list controller, and we have a base class which you can just extend to very easily customize your listing and provide all the regular operation links and everything in there. And to actually embed that screen somewhere, then you can make use of the list controller via the entity manager. you might have noticed there's some kind of pattern in how the entity controllers actually work and how they are used. And I think it's pretty useful pattern actually. So it's really the entity controllers, they provide you with reusable functionality based on some well-defined interfaces. So each of the controllers comes with its own interface which defines a public API, which everyone can make use of. But on the other side, the controllers allow you to easily customize those parts, those aspects of your entity type. Like when you want to customize how your entity type is rendered or it's edited, you'll just do that in your controller. So you can just plug in maybe another base implementation which already implements ready to use different variant of your aspect, or you can really roll your own and customize it as you want. So controllers is something that Drupal core implements and provides you with a range of different controllers. But it's also built that way that Concept can provide additional controllers. You can provide additional interfaces and implementation for those. So it's really a mechanism modules can make use of to allow for easy per entity type customization. So when you write a module and you want people to be able to integrate with that, you can make use of that. And actually, some of you might be a little bit confused about controllers if you come more from framework perspective, like an MVC framework. Then usually controllers are something completely different than as we use them for entity controllers. And what's even more confusing is that we have that now in Drupal core. We have controllers which actually are controllers in the sense of MVC controllers. And it's terminology-wise just confusing about what thing you're talking. So there's the agreement that we are renaming the entity controllers thing is to handlers or maybe entity services. There's no agreement yet on the new term, but there's agreement that we are going to rename it. So we'll see how that's going to end. Yeah, then another interesting thing that allows you to integrate with entities are now the field classes and fields in Drupal 8. Because the fields now really allow you to provide some reusable behavior along with some storage for your entity types. Like when you write some functionality that comes with storage and has some logic associated, it might make sense to just bundle it in a field, and then you can assign the fields to any entity, and everything that comes with the fields automatically is bundled on the entity. We have some simple examples of that in Drupal core. Like we have more specialized fields, like the UID field, which are not configurable fields, so they are not exposed in the interface, but they're available from the API. So you can specify, as you have seen in the comment example, just okay, my entity type is in the UID field, and the UID field will inherit all that logical behavior that comes with the field, like by default creating a new UID value when you create an entity. Language field would be another example, which also has its own default value handling mechanism. Or path field is an example we are currently working on. It's actually the idea of the path module is you have right now support for content and terms that you can enter the path alias, configure the path alias by editing the content node for the path or the term. But then we also need to save the path by its own path system. But it's really its own logic that right now works with specialized path hooks implemented by the path module. But in that issue, we are working on converting it also to work based in a field class, because the field class also have methods that allow you to react on like insertion and update of your entity, so you can take care of that logic actually in the field class. You don't need to implement the hook anymore, which then responds actually to the field being on the entity type anyway. So it's really a new way to bundle that logic together. So we are more at the beginning of starting to use that. We'll see how that works out in the end. So I will expect there's more to come into that area. Yeah, then we also have something that we call computed fields in the entity field system, which allow you basically to compute field item properties every time that they are accessed. We already have seen an example of that. It's the entity property inside an entity reference. When you do node error UID error entity, it will give you the entity object of the node output. And that's actually implemented via a computed field. And it's the same for the node body process. It gives you the process HTML of the text field. So it's the equivalent of calling basically check markup on it manually. So it's really just computed on the fly. You access the field in the back. The objects get value method will be invoked, and it will just do the computation for you, and you can just access it seamlessly. But internally, it also applies all caches and everything, so you don't have to take care of that. Yeah, so coming to another point of the presentation, which is then entity validation API. I thought I mentioned it in the beginning. It allows you to validate entities independently of the form submission, which is mostly useful in conjunction with web services. When you think now of Drupal 8 really is a RESTful server, it's not tied to serving HTML pages, it can serve JSON, XML, anything basically. And when you update an entity via a RESTful request, you of course also need to validate that entity. So for that, you really don't want to involve anything that's coupled with your regular form workflow. So you really need to be able to validate the entity independently of your form submissions and have the validation be separate. And that's implemented in Drupal 8 with the help of the Symfony validator component, which we have integrated into the API, and it works based on constraint plugins. So when you define the field, basically you can specify what are the constraints that come with the field. Like when you have a text, you can put a length constraint on it, and it will make sure that the value for the text field won't be too long. That's it basically. When you define constraints, as that you will just use it in the field definitions. There's a method set property constraints, which then allows you to put constraints on the individual field item properties. Like when you have an email field, you can put the constraints on the value. That example is actually taken from the user entity, which has a unique constraint on the email field to make sure that the email address you enter there is unique in the system. Yeah, that's pretty useful about that constraint is that the constraints have type-based defaults. I mentioned the UID field example earlier. The UID field example actually comes with a default constraint to just make sure that the value that's entered for a UID field isn't too long. And it's specified on the field type level, so it's defined with the field type, and it's automatically added in for each of the instances of the field, so you then don't have to care about that anymore. It will be automatically added in and validated for you. We probably would like should add some additional validation here to make sure that the text you enter is in the right format, so it's actually an UID value. We don't have that yet. Yeah, this is how you would be able to make use of the API. We have a validated method on the entity object, which is basically a shortcut, and invokes the Symfony validator component under the hood, and it gives you back a list of validation violations. And when you want to check whether validation was successful, you basically just check for the list being empty or not. So in that example, you see it's at the beginning, the entity is validated, and then the count is checked to 0, so there are no violations, validation was fine. And then we assign a UID value, which is too long, so it violates the constraint that's on the UID field, which says it maybe at maximum 128. It violates that, so we'll have a violation. And the violation is an object which also has some convenient methods on it, like it can give you a ready-to-use message, which you can then, for example, output in your form. Or it also knows about the context of the violation, so it knows on which entity the violation occurred. It also tells you that the property part, which is really important for being able to map back the violation to the individual form element on the form that caused the violation. Yeah, so that's constraint plugins are actually the constraint classes which define new constraints. You of course can extend them. We are making use of a lot of Symfony constraint, because Symfony really comes with most of the useful constraints already, so we don't have to reinvent a lot here. We are mostly taking care of altering the messages, which you see here in that example. The messages are just defined as public properties here, and they are also, of course, picked up by the translation system. But not allowed to say here. Yeah, and then the widgets are so those parts of the systems which are responsible for mapping back the violations onto the form elements. But it's actually right now more work in progress. So it basically works, but the whole workflow needs to be improved. So yeah, then maybe let's have a short look at entity querying. In Drupal 8, also the entity query API got much improved. So it's now you can just make use of the condition method. Like in Drupal 7, there was property condition, build conditions. You always had to think about, oh, I'm querying a property or a field. That's now a unique API, what makes it way more handy. And yeah, it's provided by a service, and you can plug the service out depending on the storage used by your entity type. So you can provide an entity query implementation that fits your storage implementation. So you really shouldn't directly query your database anymore outside of your storage controller or the entity query service in Drupal 8. Yeah, I know you might not care about MongoDB, but still it's a good idea because it will allow you to work seamlessly in multilingual environment, and it also is more it breaks less with schema changes because it's not tied to the schema that's actually in the storage controller and the implementation. So it will be more robust as well. Yeah, this is an example of how you can query for specific languages. The example is a little bit complicated because it also makes use of nesting with end condition groups and stuff like that. That's just an example, but basically it boils down of just passing the language code you want to query for as a fourth parameter on the condition method. Yeah, then we have aggregation support, entity querying in Drupal 8. You can do count queries, which is also very useful. And we have even support for relationships. So when you have two entities which are both in the same storage, you can also query for something combined in leveraging a relationship, like querying for the name of a node author. You can directly do it. Yeah, then let's have a short look at configuration entities and how those differ from the content entities. This is the definition of a configuration entity. I think it actually has the nodes type. It looks pretty much the same. It works the same way. Where the main difference, I would say, is of course the storage. So configuration entities go out to the new configuration system, to CMI. So there's the config storage controller, which is a base class, which you can just make use of, and it works very seamlessly. And the rest of the app is pretty much the same, except that the instances, the entity objects, as said, they don't have fields. So when you access node type arrow name, it won't be field, it will directly be a plain PHP value. And for defining what gets stored in the configuration file, right now the best practice is actually to put public properties on the config entity class, and by default those will be picked up and stored in CMI, or you can override that by changing the get export properties method to return whatever you want to export into the configuration object. And all that, what we have seen now, most of that, I would say, is under the hood implemented based on a new API in Drupal 8, which is called Type Data API. It's really a new API that cares about metadata and being able to leverage the metadata, so it allows you to work with any kind of database up in the metadata. So that is what's basically when you define a field definition, and also it's a generic data definition. And then the field items, those have all the definitions of what is in a field. So the system is really aware of that, and it makes it really possible for generic modules to work with your data in a generic fashion, like rules doesn't in Drupal 7, so it can be really the basis, it will be the basis for that in Drupal 8. So it will work out of the box with everything you put on an entity or in a feed. And it's also the basis for stuff like the context system EC tools, which needs exactly the same stuff. And it's really the foundation for that in Drupal 8 core. And it's automatically there in Drupal 8. Once you define the entity, you don't need to take care of that anymore, because it's really built into the API. Yeah. And the type data API, in general, shortly, it has 3 different kinds of data objects. So first there are the primitives like string, integer, float, and so on. Then there's the class of complex data. A complex data is basically a data structure which contains named properties, like a field item would be, which might contain the image file, the title, and the alt value, but also an entity which contains multiple fields. And then of course are lists which are just there to be able to deal with multiple values of something, like multiple entities, multiple strings. Yeah, and how does that all compare to the Drupal 7 stuff, you might wonder. So compared to the entity module, we have the entity wrappers, which already allow you to work with entity objects in an object-oriented way. Yeah, not very nice, but it works. But the great thing is in Drupal 8 you won't need any wrappers anymore, because all the nice things are already directly in your entity object. And the moved API is directly in your entity object. So you can say goodbye to the entity wrappers and just go with your entities. Yeah, and then the entity API controller, which is provided by the entity module, it's also basically already all there in Drupal 8. You have the entity storage controller, which takes care of all the storage. Then there was also some view related functionality in that controller in Drupal 7. That's also available in Drupal 8. It's just separated in the entity view builder, notice more clean anyway. Yeah, but there's also stuff that's so far missing that the entity module provided. Like we had an entity UI controller, which was, we have that, which is about providing like an admin UI for exportable entities. And that's somehow there in Drupal 8 with the entity list controllers, which come close to that, but it's not that far, as it doesn't provide any routes and menu items for you. So that you still have to do manually right now in Drupal 8. And then there was something called entity views controllers in Drupal 7, which take care of automatically providing view support for your entity API module entities. That's not the case right now in Drupal 8. So in Drupal 8 you manually have to do that right now, but I think we'll be able to figure something out here as well. Then we have entity property info system in Drupal 7, which is the base for the wrappers. We don't need that anymore in Drupal 8 because it's already built in, so we'll have it with the field definitions and the definitions that the individual fields already make for you. All the metadata is already there. Finally, we have the entity API controller exportable, which kind of implemented config entities in Drupal 7, but just not stored to CMI, of course, but stored with the regular database system. So it's pretty much compares to config entities in Drupal 8, so it's the same approach, but not using CMI. So I would say we have the same, but way better in Drupal 8. So Drupal 8, yeah, we are really almost there. It's already a lot of great stuff, I would say, and I'm really happy with what we have achieved so far. But still, there's a lot to do left, so there are a lot of bits and problems to figure out. So yeah, we could need some help. So if you're still here on Sunday, or maybe even Monday and Tuesday, there will be sprints, and we're looking for helpers. And so if you are interested, we will also have here, so we have a meta issue where all the remaining stuff is tracked. And there's also entity.worldcompare.ch, which is basically an overview of all the issues that are in the meta issue. And yeah, you find information about the splints on the camp website. Okay, so that's so far from my side. Any questions?
You mentioned base classes a lot. Is there some sort of overview somewhere, or there is a base class for entities or for blocks or whatever?
No, I don't think there's an overview about all the base classes yet. Documentation is definitely one of the big to-do items. That's mostly because we are still working on the API, so it's not finished at all. Right now, the easiest way to find those base classes is first of looking at our implementation and then just looking at the interface and check for classes that implement the interface. Yeah.
Here in Drupal 8, if you want to add, if a contributor wants to add a new configuration, for example, a value, simply just added a variable to the system and take care to namespacing the variable so that that doesn't conflict with others. Now we have the configuration entity. What if a contributor wants to add a new property, let's say, a new configuration to an existing entity? We have a problem right now. That module needs to expand the class, but this can lead to a race. We have two modules doing the same thing. So the problem with the configuration is that right now they are not pluggable. You cannot plug in, you just can expand it, which is okay, but it's not, I think, the most flexible way.
So you mean you would like to extend configuration objects?
I want to plug new property.
Just a new configuration
field, for example.
Then you want to just add a new configuration value to your module to make something configurable, just define a new setting. You don't need to use a configuration entity, because configuration entities are mostly used for stuff that you can add multiple instances of, so it's the only use case for them. Like node type, you know, okay, we'll have the concept of node types in the system, and then users are able to add multiple instances of those. So that would be the typical use case of implementing a config entity. So you have something you're going to add, load, and store. But when you are implementing configuration where you just have some individual settings, then you won't implement a config entity, then you can directly use schema to implement that.
Now, for example, I want to add some new fields. Let's call the fields to a core configure.
So you want to really add it to a config entity?
Yes, for example, image style. I want to add something new.
And basically, you can alter and add stuff to a config file that's not your own. Because the configuration system needs to be able to provide schema and metadata about what is in a config file for the node type or for the search settings or whatever. And so if you need to store your own information about the node type or about a view, you need to store them yourself, because the search module won't be able to provide information about what you want to store in them, and use module won't be able to provide information about what you want to add in them.
I know, but
you need to store
with the consent entities, you simply add a field.
Yeah, so for config entities, like views is implemented with plugins. So views is basically a plugin container for other things, and then you can implement plugins for views. So config entities that cannot take plugins are not extensible themselves. So if your config entity can take plugins, then you can implement your custom stuff as plugins. Like views can take all kinds of plugins. But other config entities, most other config entities are not extensible this way. So it depends on how config entities are implemented themselves. If they are implemented so they are extensible, then they are. If they are not, then there is no default extensibility, similar to fieldability as in content entities.
Yeah, so it's like when the config